Judge Michael Carter adjusted his robe as he stepped into the grand, wood-paneled courtroom. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that settled before a high-profile trial. Lawyers murmured in hushed voices, the defendant sat silently at the stand, and the gallery was filled with journalists and spectators eager for a gripping case. As Carter took his seat, he reached for the case file in front of him, flipping it open with the detached efficiency he had mastered over his years on the bench. The name on the first page made his breath hitch. David Lawson. His pulse quickened. It couldn't be. Carter's eyes lifted from the document to the man sitting at the defendant's table. His once steadfast expression flickered with something rare, uncertainty. David Lawson, dressed in a county-issued jumpsuit, sat motionless. His hands cuffed in front of him rested on the table. He looked thinner than Carter remembered, the sharp angles of his face made more severe by exhaustion. His eyes, once bright with mischief and ambition, were sunken and dulled. For a split second, time rewound. Carter saw David not as the accused man sitting before him, but as the boy he once ran through the streets with, playing baseball until the sun dipped below the horizon. He saw the teenager who had defended him in school fights, the best friend who had dreamed of a future far bigger than the city limits they were born into. But that was decades ago. Now, David sat before him as a man facing serious criminal charges. Carter's fingers curled against the edge of the bench. He had handled countless trials, each one demanding impartiality. He prided himself on being fair, unwavering in the face of emotion. But this was different. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but taut. State your case. The prosecutor stood, launching into the details. Armed robbery, resisting arrest, repeat offenses. The charges were damning. The evidence, the prosecutor claimed, was indisputable. But Carter wasn't listening to the words. He was staring at David, whose gaze remained fixed on the table. David hadn't looked at him. Not once. Carter knew that look. It wasn't defiance or arrogance, it was resignation. A man who had already accepted his fate. Carter inhaled sharply, forcing the storm of emotions to settle. He couldn't afford to let his past interfere. This wasn't two childhood friends reunited. This was the law. And now he had to decide whether justice meant upholding the charges before him or unearthing the truth beneath them. 25 years ago. The summer heat clung to the cracked sidewalks of their neighborhood, the air thick with the scent of asphalt and the distant echo of sirens. Michael Carter and David Lawson sat on the rusted fire escape of their apartment building, sharing a stolen moment of peace above the chaos of the streets below. They were just two boys, no older than 13, staring up at a sky that held dreams bigger than the world they knew. One day, we're getting out of here, Michael had said, gripping a worn baseball in his hands. David scoffed, tossing a pebble off the edge. Yeah? And how exactly do we do that? Michael grinned. I'm going to be a lawyer, maybe even a judge. David laughed, shaking his head. Man, you sound just like your mom. Michael's mother had always told him he was meant for something greater. David, on the other hand, didn't have anyone whispering promises of a future in his ear. He had Michael, though, and that was enough. For a while, at least. But fate had other plans. One evening, Michael came home to find his mother packing in a hurry. We're leaving, she said. A scholarship had come through, an opportunity for him to attend a private school in another city. Michael was ecstatic. David, however, was not. So that's it? You're just going to leave? David's voice had been sharp, edged with something Michael couldn't quite name at the time. Fear, maybe even betrayal. It's not like that. You can come with me. David laughed bitterly. Come with you? To some fancy school? You really think they take a kid like me? Michael had no answer. A week later, he was gone. Present day. Judge Michael Carter gripped the edges of his bench as the courtroom came back into focus. David still hadn't looked at him, but Michael saw him. Not just the man in the jumpsuit, but the boy he had left behind, the friend who had once been like a brother. And in that moment, one painful truth settled deep in his chest. He had made it out. David hadn't. And now he had to ask himself, was that David's fault or was it his? Present day, courtroom. Michael Carter kept his expression unreadable, but inside his mind raced. David Lawson, his best friend, his brother in all but blood, was standing before him in an orange jumpsuit, wrists shackled, face hollowed by years of struggle. Michael's grip on his gavel tightened. How had they ended up here? Years ago, a crossroads. After Michael left, David stayed behind in their neighborhood where survival was a daily battle. His mother, a woman worn down by too many disappointments, sank deeper into alcoholism. His father, he had never been in the picture to begin with. David had no one to push him forward, no escape route like Michael had. At 16, he dropped out of school. The teachers had given up on him long before that. Without money or support, he did what most kids in his position did. He adapted. And in their neighborhood, that meant hustling. He started small, running errands for older guys, carrying packages he wasn't allowed to look inside. Then came the real jobs. At first, it was just for survival. Then it became routine. By the time he turned 20, David wasn't just surviving. He was sinking. Meanwhile, Michael thrived. Private school led to law school. Law school led to a prestigious internship. From there, his rise was meteoric. Public defender, assistant district attorney, and eventually a judge. 2 boys from the same streets, the same dreams. One now held the power to decide the other's fate. Present day, courtroom. Michael forced himself to focus as the prosecutor began laying out the case. David Lawson has a long history of criminal activity, petty theft, fraud, drug possession. This time, Your Honor, it's armed robbery. Michael heard the words, but they didn't sound real. Armed robbery. The David he had known, his David, would never have done something like that. Would he? He stole a glance at his old friend. David was looking down, his expression unreadable. Did he recognize him, or was Michael just another judge about to seal his fate? David's attorney, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weary but determined look, adjusted his glasses before addressing the court. Your Honor, the prosecution has painted Mr. Lawson as a lifelong criminal, but let's talk about the circumstances that led him here. Michael leaned forward, bracing himself. The attorney continued, his voice steady. David Lawson grew up in one of the roughest neighborhoods in this city, a place where opportunities were scarce and survival often meant making impossible choices. His father abandoned him before he could even form memories, and his mother, crippled by addiction, was unable to provide for him. He had no guidance, no support, and no role models. Michael felt a lump form in his throat. He knew it was all true. The attorney turned toward the jury. Mr. Lawson isn't a hardened criminal. He's a man who made mistakes born from desperation. He's not standing here today denying his past. He's taking responsibility. Michael's gaze shifted to David. For the first time since the trial began, David looked up, meeting his eyes. Regret. Michael saw it in his friend's face, in the way his shoulders sagged, in the way his hands trembled ever so slightly. The defense attorney continued, his voice softer now. My client regrets the choices he made. He's not asking for pity. He's asking for a chance to prove he can be more than what the system has labeled him. The courtroom was silent. David still hadn't looked away. And for the first time in decades, Michael wasn't looking at an accused criminal. He was looking at his childhood friend. That night, Michael Carter sat alone in his chambers, his hands clasped together, elbows resting on his desk. The weight of the day's events pressed down on him like a boulder crushing his chest. He had spent years building a reputation as a fair, unwavering judge, one who upheld the law without bias. And yet, today, his objectivity had been shaken to its core. David Lawson. The name alone stirred memories Michael had long buried. Sneaking out of their cramped apartments as kids, running barefoot through cracked sidewalks, dreaming of escaping the suffocating grip of poverty. You'll be a lawyer, David had once joked, throwing a rock into an empty lot filled with broken glass, and I don't know yet, but we'll make it out together. Only they hadn't. Michael had been granted a scholarship, a chance to break free, while David had been left behind as swallowed whole by the same streets they once dreamed of leaving. Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The law was clear. David had broken it. Whether his past was tragic or not, justice demanded accountability. But was justice merely about punishment? He had seen criminals far worse than David walk free due to technicalities. He had seen the system fail people time and time again. Was this the same system that had failed David? Michael stood up abruptly and paced the room, his mind waging war against itself. If he ruled too harshly, would he be sentencing David to a fate he never had a chance to escape? If he showed leniency, would he be betraying the law he swore to uphold? He stared at the framed oath on his wall. Justice, impartiality, duty. But was duty enough? Could he truly be impartial when the man standing before him was someone he had once called a brother? The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, heavy, suffocating, expectant. David Lawson stood at the defendant's podium, his hands gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He looked older than his years, his face lined with exhaustion, his eyes hollowed by burdens no one else could see. Judge Michael Carter watched him carefully. The memories still lingered, but he forced himself to remain composed. He had to be the judge now, not the friend. The defense attorney took a deep breath. "Your Honor, my client would like to make a statement." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "Proceed." David hesitated, then straightened his shoulders, a quiet determination settling over him. "I plead guilty," he said, his voice rough but steady. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Michael's grip on his gavel tightened. He had expected this plea, but somehow hearing it felt like a knife to the gut. David continued, "But there's something you all need to know." The prosecution immediately objected, but Michael raised a hand, signaling them to stop. "Let him speak." David exhaled sharply, looking down at his shackled hands before meeting Michael's gaze. "I didn't do this for myself," he admitted. "I did it because I had no choice." Another wave of murmurs, louder this time. Michael leaned forward slightly. "Explain." David licked his cracked lips, his voice dropping just enough to force everyone to listen. "The robbery, I didn't plan it. I didn't even want to be there. I was set up." Michael narrowed his eyes. "By whom?" David hesitated again, but then the words tumbled out. "Vincent Russo." The name sent a chill down Michael's spine. Russo was a well-known businessman with deep political ties, but behind his polished image lurked something far more dangerous. There had always been whispers of money laundering, bribery, and organized crime, but no one had ever been able to make charges stick. Michael forced himself to keep his face neutral. "Are you saying Russo forced you to commit this crime?" David nodded. "Not just me. There are others. People like me, people with nothing, people he can use and discard." His jaw tightened. "If I didn't do what he said, my family would have suffered." A tense pause. The weight of David's words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Michael's mind raced. If what David was saying was true, this trial was no longer just about one man's crime. It was about something much bigger, something that had been rotting beneath the surface for years. For the first time in his career, Michael realized that justice wasn't as simple as guilty or not guilty. Sometimes justice meant digging deeper, and sometimes it meant fighting a battle you never saw coming. That night, long after the courtroom had emptied, Judge Michael Carter sat alone in his chambers, staring at the case file. David's words echoed in his mind. Vincent Russo. A name synonymous with power, corruption, and untouchability. Michael had presided over countless trials, heard every kind of excuse, every desperate attempt to shift blame. But this was different. This wasn't just a man looking for a way out. This was a man with nothing left to lose, telling the truth because the alternative was silence forever. He exhaled sharply, then picked up the phone. "This is Judge Carter," he said, his voice steady. "I need a private investigator, someone I can trust." The days that followed were tense. While the trial continued as expected, Michael worked behind the scenes, using his personal connections to dig into Russo's dealings. What he found chilled him. Bank statements, hidden transactions, offshore accounts, enough to suggest a vast network of illegal activities. But the most damning evidence came from a source Michael never expected. A detective, one of the few honest ones left, handed him a folder late one evening. "These are internal reports," the detective said. "Complaints, witness testimonies, people who tried to speak up about Russo but were either paid off or disappeared." He hesitated. "Your friend Lawson? He's just one of many." Michael flipped through the documents. Victims coerced into crimes, witnesses silenced, officers on the payroll. The web was bigger than he had imagined. At the bottom of the stack was something that made his breath hitch. A statement from a former employee of Russo's company, someone who had tried to come forward but had been threatened into silence. The statement included dates, locations, and even recordings implicating Russo in the very robbery David was accused of. Michael leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. David hadn't been lying, and now Michael had proof. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution was prepared to push for maximum sentencing. David sat at the defense table, resigned, expecting the worst. But Michael's gaze was steady as he picked up his gavel. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "new evidence has come to light." A murmur spread through the crowd. The prosecution frowned. The defense attorney sat up straighter. Michael turned toward the prosecution's table. "In the interest of justice, I am ordering a formal review of this case, including the alleged involvement of external parties." He looked at David, then at the silent courtroom. "This trial is not over." The courtroom buzzed with tension as Judge Michael Carter's words settled over the crowd. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. David, still seated at the defense table, looked up in stunned silence. Hope was a dangerous thing in a place like this, and he had long since learned not to rely on it. Michael took a slow breath. He had spent the entire night reviewing every legal avenue, every precedent that could justify the decision he was about to make. There was no question that David had been manipulated into this crime. The question was, did the law allow room for redemption? His gavel came down with a firm bang. "This court acknowledges that new evidence has been presented," he declared. "And given the implications of this information, I am ordering a temporary suspension of sentencing." Gasps echoed across the room. The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this man pled guilty," he argued. "Regardless of outside influences, the fact remains, he broke the law." Michael met his gaze. "And the law is not blind to coercion," he replied, "or to injustice." David swallowed hard. He had expected prison. He had accepted it. But now, was there a chance? The judge turned his attention to the defense attorney. "I am granting you time to file a motion for reconsideration. Given the evidence presented, this court will reassess Mr. Lawson's culpability and determine an appropriate sentence." The prosecutor scoffed. "So what? You're just letting him walk." Michael's voice remained firm. "I am ensuring that justice is served, and justice does not mean punishment for the sake of punishment." Silence fell over the courtroom. David finally found his voice. It was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Your Honor." He hesitated, then straightened. "I never asked for mercy. I only wanted the truth to come out." Michael nodded. "And it has." But one question still burned in his mind. What comes next? Because second chances were not given lightly, and the choice Michael made now would define both of their lives forever. The courtroom was silent, so silent that Michael could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting for his decision. David Lawson stood before him, his hands clasped tightly, his shoulders stiff with resignation. The man who had once been his closest friend now waited to hear the sentence that would determine his future. Michael had spent endless nights debating this moment. The law demanded accountability, but justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about fairness, about recognizing when someone had been set up to fail. He took a steady breath and gripped the gavel firmly. In light of the new evidence presented, this court acknowledges that Mr. David Lawson was manipulated into committing this crime. His voice was unwavering, though his emotions swirled beneath the surface. However, the law cannot simply overlook his actions. There must be consequences. David closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for the worst. Michael continued, his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Lawson, I am sentencing you to 5 years of supervised probation with mandatory community service and rehabilitation programs." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecution looked irritated, but knew they had lost the battle. David's head snapped up, disbelief written all over his face. "Probation?" Michael nodded. "You will be monitored closely. If you violate the terms, you will serve a full sentence." He let that sink in before adding, "But I believe you deserve the chance to prove that you are more than your mistakes." The weight of those words settled over the room. The man who had been abandoned by the system was now being given a chance, one that most never got. David swallowed hard. He had expected prison. He had prepared for it. But this was something he hadn't dared to hope for. The gavel came down. This court is adjourned. As the crowd began to stir, Michael remained seated, watching as David stood frozen in place. Slowly their eyes met. For the first time in years, David didn't look like a broken man. He looked like someone who had been given something far more valuable than freedom, a second chance. David stepped out of the courthouse and took a deep breath of fresh air. The world outside felt different, brighter, sharper, almost unreal. For years, he had prepared himself for the cold walls of a prison cell, but now he had been given something he never thought possible, a second chance. At first, the weight of it was overwhelming. He didn't know where to start. He had no job, no real home, and a criminal record that would follow him wherever he went. But for the first time in a long time, he had hope. Judge Michael Carter had given him that. Determined to prove himself, David threw himself into his community service. He worked long hours at a shelter, helping those who had fallen through the cracks just as he once had. At first, people looked at him with suspicion, but as the weeks passed, they saw the sincerity in his efforts. One evening, after serving meals to the homeless, an elderly woman approached him. "You remind me of my son," she said softly, pressing a warm hand over his. "He lost his way too, but he never got the chance to make things right. I hope you do." Her words struck him deeply. Support came from unexpected places. A local business owner who had once been in trouble himself offered David a job. The manager at the shelter encouraged him to keep pushing forward, reminding him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a future. Meanwhile, Michael Carter sat in his chambers, reflecting on the case that had shaken him to his core. He had spent his entire career upholding the law, believing that justice was absolute. But this case had forced him to confront a deeper truth. Sometimes justice wasn't about punishment. Sometimes it was about understanding. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His clerk entered, holding a small envelope. "Judge Carter, this was left for you." Michael took it, his fingers brushing over his name scrawled in familiar handwriting. Opening it, he found a simple note inside. "I won't waste this chance. Thank you." No signature. None was needed. Michael let out a slow breath, a rare smile touching his lips. Sometimes the law demanded punishment, but today it had delivered something far greater: redemption. Years passed. The seasons changed, the city evolved, and so did the lives of two men who had once walked the same streets as boys. Michael Carter remained on the bench, his reputation as a firm but fair judge only growing stronger. But something had changed in him since David's trial. He no longer viewed cases as just files on his desk. He saw the lives behind them, the circumstances that led people to the choices they made. And David Lawson, he had rebuilt himself from the ground up. His time in community service had turned into a passion. He started working with youth programs, helping troubled kids avoid the same mistakes he had made. Eventually, he became a public advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking at events, working with former inmates, and pushing for rehabilitation programs. One evening at a charity gala for prison reform, their paths crossed again. Michael had been invited as an honored guest, though he wasn't expecting to see David there. Yet, when he stepped into the grand ballroom, he spotted a familiar figure standing at the podium, addressing a packed audience. David spoke with conviction, his voice steady, his message clear. He talked about how society often judged people by their worst mistakes rather than their potential. He talked about how one choice, could define a person, but it didn't have to be the end of their story. Michael listened, his chest tightening with something he couldn't quite name. After the speech, David stepped down, shaking hands with attendees. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then David approached. "Judge Carter," he greeted with a respectful nod. Michael studied him, seeing not the broken man who had once stood in his courtroom, but someone who had carved a new path from the rubble of his past. "David," Michael said, his voice softer than expected. "You've come a long way." David smiled. "I had help." Michael nodded, taking in the weight of those words. "And now you're helping others. That's the goal." David hesitated, then added, For a long time, I thought fate had decided my life for me, that my path was set and there was no way out. But that day in court, you proved me wrong." Michael exhaled slowly. "I only did what was right." David shook his head. "No, you did more than that. You saw me, not just my mistakes, but me, and that changed everything." Michael felt something shift inside him, a quiet understanding. They weren't just a judge and a former defendant. They were two men whose lives had diverged and then, impossibly, intertwined once more. You gave yourself the second chance, Michael said after a moment. I just made sure you had the opportunity. David smiled. Well, I hope I'm making the most of it. Michael extended his hand. David took it, a firm, steady grip. No bitterness, no resentment, just two men acknowledging the strange, unpredictable way life had brought them back together. And for the first time in years, Michael didn't just see David as a case he once ruled on. He saw him as a friend. In the end, the story of Michael Carter and David Lawson was more than just a courtroom drama. It was a lesson in justice, redemption, and the power of second chances. Michael had once believed that justice was black and white, written in the rigid language of laws and verdicts. But David's case had taught him otherwise. Justice was not just about punishment. It was about understanding, about recognizing the complexities of human lives, the circumstances that led people to their mistakes, and the possibility of change. This lesson wasn't just for one man, it was for society as a whole. Modern applications, a justice system that heals, not just punishes. Too often, the legal system focuses solely on retribution, failing to acknowledge the potential for rehabilitation. But cases like David's prove that people weren't always defined by their worst moments. The legal system must evolve. Courts should take into account not just the crime, but the circumstances behind it. Rehabilitation programs, rather than long-term incarceration, should be prioritized for nonviolent offenders. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys must work together to ensure fair sentencing, not just harsh punishment. Dash 2. Reintegration is key. Society must provide real opportunities for former offenders who want to rebuild their lives. Businesses and communities should support second chance hiring, recognizing that people can change. Education, mentorship, and mental health resources should be made available to prevent recidivism. Through 3, the power of individual compassion. Forgiveness does not mean ignoring wrongdoing. It means recognizing growth. A second chance can change a life, not just for the individual, but for their families and communities. Everyone has the power to help others rise after they've fallen. A final reflection. Michael had learned this lesson firsthand, and as he looked at David now, not as a defendant, not as a criminal, but as a man who had turned his life around, he knew he had made the right choice. Justice wasn't just about the past, it was about the future, and sometimes the greatest verdict a judge could give was hope.